Hi everyone, this is Lychee from IVLychee here, and today I am going to rank my teams for the Call of the Abyss 6 group stage predictions, and I'm going to share that with all of you as I do so. Now, you may know that in the past years I made some pretty in-depth guides on the COA teams, but this time I'm doing a separate video just for predictions. So in general, I would say that my predictions are not going to be that different from everybody else's. Last year, my predictions were probably about 70% correct or so, though I do think I gained most of my apples from the betting phases, and I did end up with over 100,000 golden apples after Call of the Abyss 5, and as you can see, I've already spent a good amount of them on the first officer accessory and costume, and I'm just kind of saving the rest for now. So, also, I do want to say that this video is not intended to necessarily be a guide because it's just my personal opinion. So this is going to be pretty informal and it's up to you how you want to make the predictions. I'm just making these predictions based on my knowledge, which of course is just a small slice of the whole entire pie, but I will try to explain what I'm thinking as we go along here. So let's jump right into it. Now we're going to go ahead and start with Group A, and I feel like Group A is not really too hard to predict, at least for me. I'm going to put GG as first place for Group A. GG is a team from China's Identity V League, their professional league, and they won the most recent Identity V League championship in autumn of 2022. They looked really strong in the IVL playoffs, but it is hard to say if they're going to be able to keep that up consistently. GG is a team that kind of waxes and wanes a lot. They tend to either start off strong in the early season and then start losing a lot, or on the flip side, sometimes what happened in the last autumn season is I felt like they started off kind of slow, but they were able to ramp it up over time, and then they reached their peak in the playoffs. So we'll see if they're still at their peak right now or not. We haven't seen them play since autumn playoffs, so it's been a while. But historically, because mainland China is the most competitive region, any team that is high performing in the Chinese mainland should theoretically be able to hold up in the global stage. And while I think their survivor team is quite chaotic, they have achieved pretty good results, and their hunter is pretty high ranked among the Chinese teams as well. So I think that in Call of the Abyss, they definitely are going to be the strongest and most stablest team in Group A. That's what I foresee. So we have them in first. And then going to take a look at the rest of the teams for number 2, I have decided to put FPX-ZQ as the second place team here. Now, if the last time you've paid attention to FPX-ZQ is Call of the Abyss 5, then forget everything you know about them because their lineup has changed so much in the past year. They are a team from China's Identity V League, and in the most recent 2022 autumn IVL season, they placed 8th out of 10 teams, which is not a particularly high ranking. They also have had some internal conflict recently within their team, so that may further affect their performance. But at the same time, I feel like their team is very strong as well, and I do think that they should be able to hold up against the other team's hunters. For example, RC's Hunter, Aka's Hermit. I don't foresee them being unable to hold up against a Hermit, for example. So I feel like they can go in that number 2 spot. I actually really debated about this a lot though, because I feel like RC also has a bit of potential to get that number 2 spot as well. And RC, I'm going to place them in third for now. They're an Identity V Japan League team, and they placed 2nd out of the 7 teams in the IJL regular season, and they placed 4th place in the IJL playoffs. In terms of the Japan qualifiers, they had 1 loss against another IJL team, which was AXE, but they did get 2 wins against non-IJL teams. So against the community teams, they tend to do pretty well, basically. I will say they are a very impressive team. I like them a lot because they don't always go along with the typical meta picks, but I feel like because of that, their performance tends to be very variable. So when it comes to bans and picks, they really aren't necessarily a team that plays by the books very often. they have a really good hermit player on their team, and their other hunter sometimes also has these unconventional strategies even when they do play meta hunters. And then their survivor team also sometimes can get creative and go off meta as well. So yeah, they're an impressive team, but I feel like I personally still want to put them at number 3. I did see though that since we can look at the other casters' predictions, the Japan casters consistently put RC in the number 2 spot, whereas it seems like the Chinese casters put a Chinese team as a number 2 spot more often. So I definitely think there are some influences due to our own knowledge and biases, and I acknowledge that I am also biased to a certain extent as well in putting them as number 3. So for 4th place, I am going to go ahead and place GW from China as the 4th place team in Group A. I feel like GW is another team that doesn't really like to play by the books. They have a lot of really talented players and someone who picks a lot of specialty picks like Thief, Gardener, Batter, all those sorts of things. So they are a really awesome team to watch. However, I feel like as a whole, they are not quite as competitive as the other teams. They are a team from China's Identity V League, and in the autumn IVL regular season, they placed 9th out of 10 teams. So they are kind of on the lower end of the IVL teams there. In the qualifiers, their record was 3-3, so they won once against Pro Team GR, and they lost against They won against Pro Team GR, and they also won against 2 other non-pro teams. However, they also lost twice against Pro Team GR and once against Pro Team Do 5. So I feel like in general, they are kind of a little bit weaker in comparison to the other professional teams. So I'm going to put them at number 4. And then in terms of the last place team for Group A, I am going to put Before You as the last place team. Before You definitely had a super strong performance in the NAIU qualifiers, and they definitely have been trying to evolve more to fit the competitive meta of the other regions. However, even though they do seem more prepared, especially on the survivor side this year, I still think that they, out of all the teams in this group, have the biggest challenge to overcome. They are really the only team here in Group A that's not a league team, so their opponents are all playing regularly at a professional level, whereas Before You, even though they are one of the teams that works super hard in the NAEU region, I do think that it's really hard for them to compare to these other teams that play Identity V for a living, basically. So that's why I am going to put them in last place here, although I do hope that they are able to surprise us with some really outstanding results. Now moving on to Group B, I am going to put Fennel as the first place team in Group B. Now, Fennel is an IJL team, and they placed 3rd out of the 7 teams in the IJL regular season, and they placed 6th overall in the IJL playoffs. Now, I would say that for an IJL team, they seem in the kind of upper mid area in terms of their strengths. And in the Japan qualifiers, FL had a 3-0 sweep. So they had 2 wins against a non-IJL team and 1 win against fellow IJL team Dawn. I do think that they should for sure be able to get a top 3 spot in this bracket. And I also think that in terms of skill, they feel stronger to me than the other teams in Group B. So first place for Fennel seems quite reasonable to me. Now for second place, I'm going to put Axis Wave, AXE. Axis Wave is also an IJL team, Identity V Japan League team. However, they placed last in the IJL regular season in the fall, and then among the 7 teams, they pretty much lost every single matchup. So I feel like out of the IJL teams, they're kind of on the lower end. In the Japan qualifiers, they did get a 3-0 sweep, including 2 wins against non-IJL teams and 1 win against their fellow IJL team, RC, which is a very big win for them. However, the problem with AXE here, it's hard to figure out where to place them, I would say, among the 5 teams. We are trying to compare a weaker team from a strongly competitive region, which is Japan, against these remaining 3 teams that are strong teams from less competitive regions. So I really debated a lot about where I want to put Access Wave in terms of these predictions, but I feel like overall I would still put them at that number 2 spot. Now for that number 3 spot, I'm going to put ZT. ZT is from Southeast Asia region, and they performed very well in the Southeast Asia qualifiers. They are definitely a team that everybody is kind of looking out for this year. And in general, I would say that the Southeast Asia teams do feel stronger to me this year than in the past years. However, for ZT, their main hunter Sneaky can't participate in the global matches, although the replacement hunter Meowpai is also a very strong hunter and definitely has a lot of eyes on them as well. So I feel like in Southeast Asia region and kind of in the overall scope, I think they do have the potential to get a top 3 spot here and even have the potential to compete with Access Wave for that number 2 spot. Now for the 4th place spot in Group B, I am going to put RD in that spot. RD is from the Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan region, and in general, they tend to perform pretty well in that region. They do have a different hunter and a little bit of a different lineup this year than past years. However, they still held up pretty well in the qualifiers. I will say though, their survivors seem to really prioritize these stable team compositions over a lot of the other teamwork heavy supporter stunner team compositions. So sometimes it does feel to me like they don't seem to be particularly taking advantage of this current meta we have that really allows the stunners and supporters to shine. So because of that, I feel like they kind of are more stable and less, they don't seem to have that ability to kind of push themselves as far as I see some of the other teams doing. That being said, I think that they have the opportunity to really compete for a top 3 spot as well. I think it's going to be pretty close when we see AXZ, ZT, and RD go up against each other and all trying to fight for that top 3 spot. Now, in terms of the last place team in Group B, unfortunately, I am going to have to put OM in that final 5th spot. And the reason why I put OM last is because watching the NAEU qualifiers, I feel like their survivor team is not as strong as the other survivor teams on this list. And while certain members of OM do have competitive experience, I think that as a whole team, they have less experience. And in the NAEU qualifiers, I did notice that they tend to be a very hunter-sided team. And by that, I mean that their hunter Nico seemed to bring in more points than their survivors did. But against the global teams that have more cohesive survivor teams, it'll be difficult for OM's hunter to continue to dominate the way that they did in the qualifiers. Meanwhile, it'll be even more difficult for OM survivors to win against the other region's hunters, who are often even stronger than NAEU hunters. So for that reason, I have put them in the 5th place. Now next, let's take a look at Group C. So Group C, we have several teams from China and one team from Japan here. I am going to go ahead and put Dole 5 into the 1st place spot. Dole 5 is a team from China's Identity 5 League, and in the 2022 autumn IVL season, they placed 7th out of 10 teams and didn't make it to the playoffs. This was unfortunately a drastic change from the 2022 summer season last year because they won the IVL championships in the summer. But unfortunately in the fall, their survivor team just couldn't hold up to the pressure and put out good results. Their hunter though is Dong X, who is considered the strongest hunter in mainland China and arguably in the world. And he has a very large hunter pool, so can definitely fit into the current meta. Now the survivor team, I mentioned they struggled a lot last fall, but so far they have seemed to show some improvement in the mainland Chinese qualifiers. They had a 3-0 sweep against other professional teams in the qualifiers, including MRC, GW, and FPXCQ. So I feel like in terms of strength, as long as their survivor team can hold it together, they can potentially get that number 1 spot in this group. Now for the 2nd spot, I am going to go ahead and place ACT into that slot. ACT is another team from China's Identity 5 League, so they're a professional team, and they placed 3rd out of 10 teams in the last year's 2022 autumn IVL regular season, which was a record high for ACT. And then in the playoffs, they ended up in 4th place out of 6 teams. So they were defeated relatively quickly in the playoffs. I do think that against the more competitive Chinese teams, especially in a shorter, fast-paced tournament like Call of the Abyss, they may eventually struggle. But for now, I do think they can get a top 3 spot in this Group C. Also, they did have a 3-0 sweep in the mainland Chinese qualifiers, including 1 win against a pro team and 2 wins against non-professional teams. So I do think that they had a very good run in the qualifiers. They definitely do have the ability to fight for the number 1 spot as well, considering they did place higher than COA V in the autumn IVL season. However, I do think that COA V, if their survivor team can hold it together, I do think that COA V has just a slight edge potentially, especially due to their hunter, Dongx, being such a strong hunter. I do think that ACT does have a pretty strong hunter in Yuya as well, but Dongx has a larger hunter pool, which I think may play into his advantage a little bit more. In the 3rd place, I'm going to put WBG, which is another team from China's Identity V League. Like FPX ZQ, they also had a ton of member changes. In fact, a lot of the Weibo and ZQ players ended up transferring to each other's teams after Call of the Abyss 5, which was pretty funny. But they are an IVL team, and in the 2022 autumn IVL season, they ended up in 4th place in the regular season out of 10 teams, and they ended up in 5th place out of 6 teams in the playoffs. So they had a little bit of a shorter playoff run, and I would say that I put them after ACT mostly because ACT recently went against WBG in the China qualifiers this year, and they won. So that is the most recent time that they have played each other, and that is why I've chosen to rank them like this. I do think that WBG does have a fighting chance against ACT though, to try to get that number 2 spot or something like that. However, I do think that they have a slight edge potentially over SC, potentially because SZ is a very strong team as well, and they also potentially could win and get a top 3 spot against WBG. Who knows? Comparing SZ and WBG, I feel like WBG can potentially be better at strategically taking advantage of the opportunities that are given to them by other teams. Let's talk a little bit about SZ first, and I'll come back to this. So SZ is a team from the Identity V Japan League, IJL, and they didn't really have a great run in autumn IJL season. They placed 5th out of 7 teams. However, they did manage to step it up for the autumn playoffs, and they ended up in 3rd place. So that was pretty good, and they actually pre-qualified for Call of the Abyss 6 as the team with the next highest overall score in the 2022 playoffs overall. Then it didn't have many lineup changes over the past year as well. Similar lineup to the previous time they competed in Call of the Abyss, and their survivor team is actually often compared to the Chinese team Wolves because of their style. They tend to play very teamwork heavy, sometimes pretty aggressive as well. And their hunter side, like Japanese teams, a lot of times they like to utilize both of their hunters too. That is kind of characteristic of the Japanese teams to switch off their hunter after the first round, I would say. So I mentioned I previously almost put WBG below SZ, but however, I just feel like WBG's survivor team can hold up against SZ's hunter, whereas SZ's survivors could really go either way against WBG's hunter. WBG's hunter tends to play things very safe, whereas, like I mentioned, SZ survivors tend to play pretty aggressively. So if SZ makes it into the top 3, I feel like it's going to be from this kind of sudden burst of strength, whereas if WBG makes it into this 3rd place, it's probably going to be an advantage from their steady gameplay. From the hunter side, at least. I don't know if I would say the survivor side is always the most steady. They do sometimes find themselves in hot water as well. So SC definitely has a fighting chance against WBG and even ACT as well. But ultimately, I just foresee WBG having perhaps a slight edge over SC. Next, we're going to look at number 5, and this is, of course, RB. RB is a team from China's Identity V League, and in 2022 autumn, they placed last out of 10 teams in the regular season, so they did not make it to the playoffs. They are pretty much considered to be the weakest IVL team. And in the Chinese mainland qualifiers, although they managed to qualify, their record was 3-2, and I will say their performance was not really the most spectacular. They won against 3 non-professional teams and lost against 2 professional teams, and those 2 professional teams happen to be ACT and WBG, who are also in Group C. So of course I'm going to rank them below ACT and WBG and last in this group. Now, last but certainly not least, we're going to take a look at Group D. Now for Group D, I am going to go ahead and move Wolves into the number 1 spot. Wolves are the Call of the Abyss 5 champions, so they are the reigning Call of the Abyss champions, and they have maintained a relatively similar team lineup since last year. They are a team from China's Identity V League, so in autumn 2022 IVL, they did pretty well. They came first in the regular season, and they actually came out of finals as the runner-up team after GG. So they pre-qualified for Call of the Abyss as the team with the next highest score in overall 2022 IVL. I do think that their performance is a little bit more volatile this year than it has been in the previous year, but still, their rankings prove that they are still one of the strongest teams in China. So globally, that means that they would be a very, very strong team. Now, in the number 2 spot, I think Zeta from Japan is going to get that number 2 spot. Zeta is an IJL team, and they are certainly a very stacked team in terms of talent. After Call of the Abyss 5, the runner-up team, which some of you may know, which was SST, they disbanded, and several of their team members then joined Zeta, who already have these very high-profile players to begin with, but now just have even more of this high-profile, talented lineup here on their team. They won the most recent IJL championship in 2022 autumn, so they pre-qualified for Call of the Abyss 6. And although we haven't seen them play in tournament in the past few months, based on their talent and past performance, I definitely think they are top 2 in this group and have a shot at top 1 in this group as well. They have both very strong hunters and a survivor team that plays very well to this current meta. I still put them below Wolves though, because I feel like Wolves just has a little bit more experience and just history of a strong performance over the past 2 years, and they had, only 1 member change. So I think that Wolves, to me, feel a little bit more likely to get that number 1 spot and be guaranteed that number 1 spot as opposed to Zeta. However, like I mentioned, Zeta is super strong as well and definitely have a shot at number 1 as well. Now for number 3, I think that GR is probably most likely going to get that number 3. GR is a team from China's Identity V League, and in 2022 IVL, they placed 5th out of 10 teams in the regular season and 3rd out of 6 teams in the playoffs. So definitely not a bad run for GR in the autumn season. Their performance in Call of the Abyss qualifiers, though, was not necessarily very consistent. They did, for example, lose once against GR, which is another Identity V League team that is one of the less competitive IVL teams. So I think that GR is a little bit less strong and stable than Wolves and Zeta, and that's why I'm putting them in at number 3. However, they are still competitive as well. I mean, really, China is just such a competitive region that even these mid teams are still pretty strong when it comes to the global stage. That leads us right into why I'm putting MS as the number 4th team. MS is pretty strong among the Korean teams, but they previously haven't been very strong when competing internationally against Japanese and Chinese teams. I will say that their hunter seems to hold up pretty well against these other Korean teams, but I feel like their survivors are kind of more of like a tie team rather than a 3-player escape, 4-player escape kind of team. So that's part of the reason why I feel like they're less strong competitively. And then number 5, I am going to put GH from Southeast Asia region. GH, they pre-qualified for Call of the Abyss 6 after winning the 2022 SEA IVC. So we can certainly see that they are very, very strong in Southeast Asia region. They have many veteran players as well, and they have that tournament experience for sure. However, pretty much all the teams they're going against also have veteran players with tournament experience. So I feel like that alone is not enough to push them up in the rankings. So while they can potentially go against MS and try to beat MS out of their spot, I think they will still have a very hard time placing into the top 3 of Group D. So I have put them, unfortunately, as number 5. So that is it for the predictions. And I can't guarantee, honestly, that I won't change my mind again after this video is over. But for now, I do feel pretty content with these choices. Plus, if everything's for certain, then this wouldn't be as fun, right? So again, these predictions are just my personal opinion. Please feel free to share your thoughts and opinions below as well. I would love to see what all of your predictions are. And if this video was helpful, let me know as well if you want to see more predictions as we go along and follow Call of the Abyss. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.